Chapter 1. We're not going to actually get into the book of Exodus verse by verse or whatever, section by section this morning. I want to give you an introduction to this. I told you that we were going to go in this direction a couple of weeks ago, and there's a little outline you can follow along in your bulletin if you'd like. And I'll put a little PowerPoint thing up behind me. There is a text I would like you to turn to, 2 Corinthians chapter 3. We'll get there eventually, but did you notice the background for all the slides this morning was actually people walking kind of in this direction? That's an internet picture of the Exodus. And so is this right here. So that's a background for our presentation. And when we get to it, we'll start clicking along. But if you want to find 2 Corinthians chapter 3, we'll be there in a little while, not right away, but we will be there eventually. Exodus. I'll have to admit to you, I've never preached through an Old Testament book. I have taught through numerous sections of the Old Testament, one-on-one and discipleship groups and stuff like that, but I've never preached through a whole book. And I've never preached through a book so long. It's 40 chapters long. There's large sections of narrative in the book, so we'll move through it quickly because some of the stories are really well known. Others are a little bit less known, but nonetheless, I want to put Exodus in your mind somewhere. Let's start with a general idea. First of all, Exodus is the natural follow story of Genesis. As a matter of fact, the Hebrew text ends with "in Egypt" in Genesis chapter 50, because that's where Jacob dies and Joseph's brothers reconcile. Chapter 50, that's a pretty interesting story. And the next word in the book of Exodus is the word "and." So it's whoever wrote the book of Exodus, and I think it's Moses, he expects you to know what happened in Genesis. So I expect you to know what happened in Genesis. Otherwise, Exodus won't make any sense. There's a natural flow from one book to the next. That's just part of the story. It's the second book in the Bible, and it's a continuation. As I said, one commentator says, from the outset of Exodus, the Exodus narrator presupposes that the reader is familiar with the Genesis story. So you guys talk back to me for a minute. What are some things in Genesis that stand out to you? Creation. Okay, that's a huge section. I mean, that's the first 3 chapters of Genesis. What's next?
Fall.
Fall is part of the creation story. Okay, what's next? Cain and Abel. That's not a primary part of the story, but it's definitely in there. That's where the obvious problems with sin start to manifest themselves. What's next? Flood. Yeah. Genesis chapter 6 through 8 is Noah and the flood. And he's a pretty minor character as well. Who's next? Abraham starts in Genesis chapter 12. And he is a critical person in the Old Testament. His name just comes up over and over and over. As a matter of fact, if you're a child of God, you are a son of Abraham by faith. So you're connected to him, whether you like it or not. Yeah. Who comes after Abraham? Isaac, he's his son, his miracle son, born when he was 100 years old, etc. We don't hang around Isaac very long. Who's next? Jacob. He's the grandson who was the second born of twins. He got picked because God prophesied he would be picked. And who's the most important son of Jacob? Well, Joseph takes up the rest of the book, chapter 37 to chapter 50. He's the biggest talked about character in the book of Genesis. And he goes to Egypt ahead of everybody, and he receives Jacob and his family of 70 people, and they settle in a place called Goshen. But between the end of Exodus and the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, how many years transpire? 400. What does that reflect and remind you of? How many years between the end of Malachi and the beginning of Moses? 400 years. So is there a possibility that there's a connection there? At the end of Genesis, 400 years transpire, and all of a sudden the deliverer is born. At the end of Malachi, a new deliverer is born at the beginning of Matthew, Jesus. So the connection is, if you don't know the story of Genesis, you won't see the connection right away. But you need to recognize there's a distinct connection. So the book of Exodus is a story that speaks into all of redemptive life. The rescue of God's people in this story, which ancient historians think is a complete myth, is a picture of the rescue of God's people through Jesus Christ at the cross. There's delicate differences, but actually Moses prophesied a prophet would come, like Moses, but unlike Moses, and he would deliver his people. And you and I are in that mix. So that's why Exodus matters. It just matters a great deal. The book of Genesis unpacks, tells us, how did we get here? How did this whole thing start? I'm reading an interesting book right now called The Soul of Science by Nancy Kersey and a PhD in chemistry who hits me at the top of my head. But it's an interesting book because the world does not like what's in Genesis, and they reject what's in Exodus. Period. The idea that God created the world bugs people to death, especially in the academic world. And they don't like what's in Exodus either because there's no evidence, at least in the ground or in archaeology, that says Moses actually went into Egypt, was reared there and came out of it, brought the people of Israel out. Joseph's not even mentioned in the ancient text anywhere. And there's a logical explanation for that, but we'll get to that eventually, okay? So, let's put some things up here. Moses is the human author. You already knew that, right? But he never says in the text, I wrote this book. Paul says that oftentimes, but doesn't say that in the text. So I just embrace that idea by faith. Secondly, the subject is the formation of the nation of Israel by God. So how did America start? You all know that story? If you went to some history classes, you probably got a mixed idea about that. But America was started by the Pilgrims and the people at Jamestown. That's how it started. And we rebelled against England's oppressive stuff. I taught it for years. But how did the nation of Israel start? Well, Isaac was technically the first Jew. And from Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes, and off we go. Third part, the setting is Egypt. Two things in the book of Exodus. The two settings are the country of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, Sinai wilderness. And where did Moses spend middle 40 years of his life? On the Sinai wilderness, walking sheep around. God has this master plan, you know. I want to divide Moses' life. We'll get to this. I'll probably say this a couple of times. But Moses lived to be 120. The first 40 years of his life, he lived in Egypt. And we'll get to that story next week. How did he actually show up? He's a Levite. And he's got a brother and a sister. And they play an important role in his life, etc. But the first 40 years of his life were spent in Egypt. And at the end of those 40 years, what happened to Moses? What did Moses do that drove him out of Egypt? Someone tell me. He killed somebody. A complete stranger, in a fit of rage, just murdered this guy and buried him in the sand. Well, someone rats him out, and he has to become a fugitive. So for the next 40 years of his life, he's a fugitive. He goes to the Sinai Peninsula. He escapes out of Egypt the way people would escape out of Egypt. And for the next 40, he meets a young woman at a well. That's a common story in the book of Genesis. Meeting women at the well. He meets a woman at the well. He ends up marrying her, named Zipporah. And he joins the family of his father-in-law, Jethro. And he guides sheep around. He went from Pharaoh's court as an adopted son, pulled out of the river, and he ends up guiding 100 sheep, probably 100 sheep, in the wilderness of Sinai, because grass is so thin out there, you have to take your sheep out, constantly moving and stuff like that. It's just an arid place. You gotta have thousands of acres to feed 100 sheep. So he's wandering around, and we'll get to that text eventually. The most important text, I think, at the beginning of Exodus is in Exodus 3. And I'm anxious to get to it because it's just rich with all kinds of insight and meaning. And then God calls Moses, and what does he tell Moses to do? Go back, go back. I changed who you are. Now that you spent 40 years wandering around with sheep in the desert right here and figuring out life, I need you to go back and lead my people. So the last 40 years of his life is essentially what Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are about. And that's the most we know. We don't know much about his first 40 years of living, except he got really angry and killed somebody. We don't know much about his second 40 years of living. He got his sheep around and met God in the wilderness. We know a great deal about what happened the last 40 years of his life. So I figure I can't do anything really important until I'm 80. Moses did nothing important until he was 80. All right. Let's move forward. So I draw a conclusion from that. First of all, Genesis tells us where we came from and our purpose. And you either agree with it or you disagree. And that's not going to change. Is that how we got here? It's either true or it's not. And if we're kind of on the bubble, we take all the stuff that's out in the world and we try to fit Genesis into it. Or this is what's truth. We take what's in the world and fit it into Genesis. If it doesn't fit in there, it's wrong. It's mixed up. It's confusing. It's twisted. One or the other. The same thing is true of Exodus. Exodus tells us why Israel is important to God and how the nation was formed. Okay? So that's a flyover picture of Genesis and Exodus. I did a series in my last church many years ago called Origins, and I just preached through the first 11 chapters of Genesis. What's the origin of man? What's the origin of sin? What's the origin of the universe? What's the origin of relationship? What's the origin of reconciliation? Just origins, just packed full of origins. How everything came about. All right. And Exodus is, well, how did we get the country of Israel? The people of Israel. This explains it completely. That's how they arrived. And this story to them is the critical mass of their own identity. All right. I want to talk about Egypt for a few minutes because it's an important piece of the puzzle. So let's talk about this for a few minutes. The word Egypt occurs 700 times in the Old Testament, 25 times in the New Testament. The history of Egypt in the Bible goes back to the flood waters that subsided in Genesis 8 through 10, where the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, began to repopulate the earth. Ham had 4 sons, and one son was Mizraim. Genesis chapter 10, verse 6. He became the man who settled the country of Egypt. And Ham went down there, his father, and lived with him. So, Mizraim is the word in Hebrew that's translated Egypt in our Old Testament. So, Egypt, out of the land of Egypt, out of Egypt, occurs another 114 times in the Old Testament. So, Egypt is a symbol of a place you need to come out of. It symbolizes the entire life without Christ in the New Testament. When we encounter Egypt in Exodus, we are looking at a world power, leader in the region of the Eastern Mediterranean. And it's interesting, we don't have a single name of anybody in the book of Exodus who was in Egypt. We don't have any names. It's called Pharaoh. So placing this story is challenging for historians and so forth. The truth of the matter is that's not the point. There's a gigantic academic argument about what century this actually took place. And one author says, you know what, in the grand scheme of things, it really doesn't matter. The country of Egypt is pretty much dependent upon a single thing. It's the Nile River. The Nile River is, I think it's the second longest river in the world. And I've actually been on it, go figure, when I was in Uganda. Every year the Nile overflows, and so everybody in Egypt lives within 5 miles of the river. And as long as it overflows properly, everyone's perfectly content. The gods are happy, everyone's blessing the gods and blessing the Pharaoh. When it doesn't overflow enough, there's not enough food. When it overflows too much, it's disastrous. So whatever happens with the Nile, of course the Nile's a god. They worship the Nile. So the Nile is a critical piece to the story. And God's very unhappy when we worship things instead of the Creator. So that plays into the story of the 10 plagues. Egypt has some natural boundaries. On the east side, you have arid areas and cliffs that lead up to the Red Sea. On the western side, you have the Sahara Desert. On the south, you have cataracts and waterfalls, which are difficult for people to navigate to come up the river to attack the country. And on the north, you have the Mediterranean Sea. And nobody did amphibious landings to attack countries in those days. It wasn't heard of. You have two little spots. You have the northwest, which is on Libya's side, and they were always pretty good friends with Libya. On the east side of Egypt, the northeast, I got those directions mixed up. That was a land bridge to Central Asia. So they were always concerned what was going on at the land bridge right there. So where does Jacob's 10 sons come from to go get food in Egypt during the Great Famine at the end of Genesis? They came from the northeast. That's where everybody streamed in. Famine was a huge problem in the northeast. And so people were coming to Egypt because they had a delta area and the Nile River, an abundance of food. And then when Egypt had a serious problem, where people go? Egypt was not prepared, and Joseph got them prepared because God went before him. That's how they managed to get food out of Egypt. God knew the famine was coming. He prepared Egypt to get ready for it. So the Nile was an agricultural blessing, and it actually brought the children of Israel, the 10 older brothers of Joseph, to Egypt, simply because of this issue of the Nile. Let me just touch on one more issue, and then we'll start moving on. Egyptology, and I remember when the Sphinx was, when Tutankhamun was discovered, and they had these Egyptian presentations in museums and everything else. The truth of the matter is, ancient Egypt is pure speculation. Because they wrote everything on papyrus, and papyrus does not last eternally. Clay tablets do, but papyrus just deteriorates over time. There are no records whatsoever of Israel's time in Egypt. None. So the story of the Bible is exclusive. There is no evidence that it's true, and there's no evidence that it's not true. It's just a story that the Israelites told over and over. It's the most told over story in ancient history. And of course, if you don't believe in Jesus and the Word of God, you're not going to believe that. It's just a myth to you. We either accept the story of Genesis, Exodus by faith, or we don't. It's as simple as all that. One commentator says, what are we to make of this work that claims that God intervened in human history 3,000 years ago by performing signs and wonders in ancient Egypt, revealing himself in a theophany at Mount Sinai, and even condescending to dwell among a community of refugee slaves? What are we supposed to do with that? What do we do with this incredible story? If you've been spending time in Sunday school or Bible classes as a child, you were told these stories. On flannel graph, on video clips, or whatever, these stories hang on you. And we have reliable ancient texts that stipulate to the story. All right? Genesis tells us about the Creator and how we got here. Exodus tells us how God chose Israel and made them into a nation. Those are two really important pieces to the puzzle. So I want to move on, okay? Let's talk about an outline. Genesis really basically boils down to three big sections. 1 through 14 is the rescue. And everybody in here needs to be rescued. If you came from a stable home, great parents, all that stuff, you still need to be rescued by Jesus. And the book of Exodus speaks to that. There's Moses in chapter 1 and 2, and then there's God in Exodus 3 through 14. Moses creates a serious mess out of his life. At the end of 40 years, he's a murderer and a refugee, and at the end of 80 years, he's clueless about life. He's thinking to himself, I guess I'll just die out here. Here's what I think the story of Moses tells me. At the bottom line, in the first 14 chapters, God has all the authority in the universe, and he only has it for one reason. He is the holiest being out there. I want you to think about that topic, because I'm going to keep bringing it up over and over and over. The reason that God runs the universe, he's in charge of everything, it's not because he's more powerful than anybody else, because we think he's awesome, as cool as that is. He is in charge because he is holy. Period. I'm not in charge because I am not holy. And no one should let me be in charge because I am unholy. I have corrupt motives, all kinds of weird stuff going on inside of me. There's nothing righteous inside of me. I'm a broken sinner. And Moses proves that to us over and over and over. Holiness is a critical element in the story. And we don't hear about God's love until we get to John chapter 3, verse 16. We hear about God's holiness in the Old Testament, and it's a critical piece. And I think that Moses' encounter with God is a central point that locks us theologically. One author that I'm reading says, we think that the Old Testament center, theological center, is the law. But he would suggest to us that Moses' encounter with God at the burning bush is the central point of all that stuff. Why does God have a right to make the laws? Let's move on. Exodus chapter 15 through 24. Because he's holy, guess what? He gets to make all the rules. I make rules and it's like, there's a little compromising going on, and I twist things a little bit so it leans in my direction, benefits me, etc., etc. The truth of the matter is that's not how God functions. He is perfectly upright. Every law he makes perfect, godly sense. No one's benefited more than someone else. So the next big section is law. They come to Mount Sinai. God wants to get his people in front of him. Of course, they freak out because he's just beyond their imagination on that blazing mountain. That's the picture up there. God's rules come out. And when I was a kid growing up, every Sunday morning in church, guess what they did? They read the Ten Commandments. Just so that I wouldn't forget them. I didn't even memorize it. I heard them every Sunday morning for like 19 straight years. Here's what I get out of it. God's holiness gives him authority to make all the rules. You don't want me to make rules because I'm not holy. I'll make them to benefit me. So that's what the middle of Exodus tells me. That's a critical piece to the puzzle. You see how this whole thing is starting to transpire? And then Exodus chapter 25 through 40 is about worship. And of course the rest of the story is about the tabernacle. So who deserves to be worshipped? What is idolatry? It's picking something that's not holy and giving it worship. So there's God's tabernacle. There's Israel's idolatry. I mean, chapter 32 sticks out in your mind like, what is going on? You're at the mountain of God and you're making an idol? Of course, God's pretty unhappy about that. Guess how many people died on that day? 3,000. One commentator suggests it was mirrored in Acts chapter 2 when 3,000 people were saved on the day that God revealed himself by the Holy Spirit. I don't know if that's true or not. It's curious. Okay? There's God's presence in chapter 33 and 34, which is a critical part where Moses goes up the mountain and sees God and comes back with his face all shined up so that people can't look at him. He wears a covering on his face for the rest of his life. In the book of Genesis, in the first 3 chapters, God is in the Garden of Eden with the people. No issues about blazing light. You can't stand in God's face. I assume that he was right there. They could see him. And then when sin came, he drove them out of the garden. And this is the next moment when God's presence is on the earth in a meaningful way before a sinful man. And chapter 40, what does God do? At the end of chapter 40, his presence is manifest in the Shekinah glory for the first time. Starting to see some patterns in here. There are some pretty cool patterns. And this is the final one. God's holiness commands worship from all creatures. So, this whole idea of authority is an essential idea throughout the Scriptures, and God's holiness is the foundation of all of it. Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. Let me read this to you. Say therefore to the people of Israel, this is God talking to Moses, I am the Lord, and I will bring them out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as for a possession. I am the Lord. That's a summary of what happened in the book of Exodus. God said, I am going to do this. God does it, and you better give God the credit for it. It's his deal. Simple as all that. So there's our outline. Pretty simple. My outline is much more detailed than that. Let's draw some conclusions. I want you to hear this just for a moment. God calls his people. He protects his people. He challenges his people. And he guides his people to the relationship that he intends with his people. That's a conclusion I draw from this whole story. God calls his people. He protects his people. The plagues prove it. He challenges his people. Sinai proves it. He guides his people. He actually walks them by direction of Moses through the wilderness. And then once the tabernacle is set up, we have the Shekinah glory. And a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. He is on duty 24/7, guiding his people to the relationship that he intends to have with his people. God is the ultimate authority over right and wrong. He makes the rules. The book ends with God establishing his place in the center of God's people's lives. I want to just chit-chat with you for a minute. The tabernacle was first on the outside of the camp, and then it was moved to the inside of the camp, right in the middle. And there's enough evidence that says that people camped around the tabernacle in the shape of a cross. You just take the numbering system for all the different tribes, and if you stack them up, there's a cross literally moving through the wilderness. Every time it moves, they move up, pick up, and And they set up camp in the shape of a cross. And the door of the tabernacle faced east, and the priests camped on the east side of the tabernacle as the sun came up so they could make sure that the door was open at the beginning of the day. And the worst place was to be on the outside of the camp, away from God. He literally shuts down the door of Eden so that no one can get in there. And now he says, I want to live amongst my people. But even the tabernacle has three places: a common place, a restricted place, and a holy place. So all this stuff is pointing towards God's holiness and our unholiness and how God's going to fix that problem. Exodus is always pointing to something greater, which is a remarkable concept that speaks to me. Turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and I'm going to read this text to you, first 11 verses. And from this text tells me that that's true. All right? Follow me along, because the first couple of verses seem to be off point. Just follow along. Verses 1 through 11. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you from you? You yourselves are a letter of recommendation written on our hearts, to be known and read by all. And you show that you are a letter from Christ, delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Such is the confidence that we have through Christ toward God. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything as coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of the new covenant. Now he starts to leak into the Old Testament, especially the book of Exodus, the new covenant. Not of the letter, that's Moses and the finger of God literally writing, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Verse 7, now the ministry of death, and Paul calls the covenant of law that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai the covenant of death. The ministry of death, carved in letters on stone, came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of his glory, which was being brought to an end. Will not the ministry I lost my place. For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, verse 8, will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, the ministry of righteousness must far exceed in glory. That's where I got that whole holiness. The ministry of righteousness. God steps into Israel's life, and he's pure holiness. He tells Moses, you need to take off your shoes, buddy. This is not a safe place for you. If you're going to walk into the Holy of Holies, you've got a whole day of preparation, and you have to be the high priest. When Jesus died on the cross, what happened? That veil was torn in two. Guess what? Everything's been resolved. No more sacrifices. God's holiness has been assuaged by the sacrifice of Christ. So the grand theological story of Exodus is critical to the story as it played itself out. Let's keep reading verse 10. Verse 10. Indeed, in this case, what once had glory has come to have no glory at all. That's the story of Exodus, because of the glory that surpasses it. For if what was being brought to an end came with glory, much more will be what is permanent that has glory. It's interesting verses, etc. I want to draw three simple conclusions at the end right here, and we'll call it quits. There's our text. If you want to read that again this week, please do. First of all, the physical rescue of Israel from Egypt is a picture of the spiritual rescue that God offers at the cross of Jesus Christ. Let me ask you a question. What's the most spectacular miracle that happened in the modern age? Birth? The resurrection? Christ? That's it. It didn't cost God anything for Jesus to rise from the dead. It doesn't cost God anything to bring a baby into the world. It cost God everything to bring me into salvation. What did it cost God to get his people out of Egypt? It didn't cost him a blink of an eye, twitching thought. He just took care of business. And Pharaoh's saying, I'm beating this guy. You don't have a prayer, buddy. You're a lost cause. What fool was in his army and after them into the Red Sea? That's insanity. He did. But it cost God everything to bring me to Jesus Christ. It cost him the death of his son. That's the greatest miracle that happens in any given day in the modern world. I don't care where it happens. In Indonesia, in Africa, in Asia, in the United States. That's the most incredible thing. It cost God everything for that, so that that could actually take place. The comparison between what happened in the story of Exodus and what happens every day is out of this world. It just pictures, this is what God's going to do. That's the first lesson from the book that I think is important to understand and know. The second one, the revelation of God in Exodus is about his holiness. God's holiness is always first in salvation. When a person comes to Christ, if you want to just have a happier day, if you want to just, have a nicer life, that's not where we should start. We start with, I am a wretch on my way to hell, and unless God steps in, I'm gone. I recognize he's holy and I'm not. He's sinless and I'm sinful. And that's how we come to Christ. God's holiness had to be dealt with. His demands for a holy people had to be dealt with at the cross. If that was never dealt with, I would not be in. It's as simple as all that. There's some text to prove it. Third one. The covenant making and covenant keeping God is defined who he is. I said to somebody, what are you hoping what is your salvation rest on? And they said, well, on Jesus. I said, it's a little more complicated than that. It rests on a single fact, that when God makes a promise, he intends to keep it. What if God just said, I changed my mind, these people are driving me nuts, you're all out of here. What? That would be a disaster for everybody. We'd be wasting our time trying to build apartments and move on. It all rests on the fact that God, he's been keeping his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He intends to keep his covenant with Moses and with God's people. And he never goes back on his word. I'm going back on mine, you're going back on yours. God never goes back on his word. I am so happy about that. Yet Exodus reveals that this holy God is not seen by Israel. His presence is limited because his holiness is not yet assuaged. Therefore, he is represented by visible symbols, and his demands are stated in the Mosaic covenant, the law of God captured in the Ten Commandments. So the book of Exodus is full of all these pictures and symbols without the actual presence. So we'll touch on some of that stuff along the way. Tabernacle points to Jesus, to God. What Israel experienced is a picture of what New Testament believers experience as they come out of the world and into the family of God. I'll stop right there and call this quits. When Israel came out of Egypt, they never really left Egypt, did they? As a matter of fact, everybody who was over 20 years old, guess what? They all died in the wilderness and were buried in the sand. They never crossed over into the Jordan into the Promised Land. As we come to Christ, what's the Holy Spirit's job? Okay, he's now in my life, but I still think like this natural, pagan, wicked Egyptian character from the story. I continuously whine about what I used to have, but I don't have now. I'm completely confused about what's going on in my world. It's turning upside down every day. And Israel is that person. They want water, they want food. mean, God provides everything. Water out of rocks, bread from the sky, they're not satisfied. They don't have the Holy Spirit. So, we're in much better shape. That's where we're gonna go. I'm really looking forward to this journey, and I'm kind of stoked about it, as you probably can tell. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for the book of Exodus. It explains an awful lot of things that are going on in our world today, that challenge us. But for me, your holiness is on top of that whole list. And as we think about this big picture this summer and into the fall, and the story and how it plays itself out in our world, I pray that you'll manifest your redemptive grace, help us to understand what all this stuff means, how it applies to us. Take the book of Exodus, bring it alive to us. Use me to kind of nurture that along, and I pray that after we're done with this study, the Old Testament will come to life like it's never been before. Thank you for Moses. He lived a tough 80 years for you. You used him, and when you did, it was world-shattering. So bless your word, Lord, this week as we read it, study it, and we gather next week to begin to process the story of Exodus. What a jewel in the Old Testament. Bless us now as we close and end with a song in Jesus' name.